We have breaking news this afternoon regarding a potential deal between the PGA Tour and Saudi Arabia's public investment fund, which, of course, runs Live Golf. Now, President Donald Trump initiated a meeting with PGA Tour Commissioner Jay Monahan, player directors Tiger Woods and Adam Scott, along with PIF Governor Yasser Al-Rumayyan, all happening at the White House. I'd like to welcome in senior Golf Channel writer Rex Hoggard, who has been covering this story from the beginning. And Rex, simply, what is the purpose of this meeting today?
This is a critical next step in the negotiations between the two sides. You're talking about the Public Investment Fund of Saudi Arabia and the PGA Tour. Now, remember, earlier this month, on February 4th, the president met with Commissioner Jay Monahan as well as Adam Scott, but Tiger Woods was not in that meeting. He was back home in South Florida with his late mother when she was passing. Also, Yasser Al-Rumayyan was not in that meeting. So you would think the addition of both of those two would be a huge escalation in where this is going to go. And the ultimate goal here is to reunify the game under one umbrella.
All right, Rix, we have heard for months now, from the PGA Tour at least, that talks that are ongoing are moving in a positive direction. At the day's end, could we actually have a deal today between the Public Investment Fund of Saudi Arabia and the PGA Tour?
Yeah, it's important to point out here that this meeting is still ongoing. So we're looking at a 3-hour meeting. There's a lot going into this. And certainly they could reach an agreement in principle. Now, there would still be, obviously, details to be sorted out. I'm sure lawyers for both sides would want to take a hard look at that. And also other voices would want to be involved in this. The DP World Tour would be one of them. But certainly moving forward, you would think that they could come to some sort of at least agreement in principle. Ultimately, the policy board of the PGA Tour will decide if this goes forward, though.
Yeah, and that policy board meeting right now is scheduled for Bay Hill at the Arnold Palmer Invitational. We will see if an emergency one is called. There's a lot still to be processed through this meeting. Again, 5 in this meeting initiated by President Donald Trump. One of those in the meeting, Adam Scott, and he, of course, is a player director for the PGA Tour Policy Board. Here's what he had to say yesterday prior to this meeting. He said, quote, "It's not solely the tour's decision." You know what I mean? There's 2 people in this discussion, more to be honest, the DP World Tour, a lot of other stakeholders in the pro game. The tour and its representatives talk a lot about it, but we're not in control of the entire situation. There's another side of the story, and one side, membership of the PGA Tour. And we welcome in Eamon Lynch, who has, of course, been following this story like all of us here at Golf Channel. First, I would like to get your take on the significance of this meeting and who's in that meeting today.
If you're in the golf world, I think it's enormously significant. I mean, non-golfing citizens must wonder how golf became a priority worthy of presidential intervention in some respects. But as Rex said, there is a big difference between an agreement in principle, which I think we are getting close to, and an agreement in practice, because that's an awfully complex landscape. You're talking about, as Adam Scott just mentioned, different tours, different sponsors, tournaments, players, fans. There are a lot of particulars have to be worked out. Some of those were in proposals that the tour had before the Department of Justice over the course of the last year. What we don't know is if what's happening in the White House today fundamentally upends what those proposed deals were, because the parameters that may apply under the Trump administration may not have been the same parameters that the DOJ would have applied under the Joe Biden administration.
Yeah, and of course the DOJ has to sign off on this agreement, and obviously with President Trump initiating this meeting, it sounds like that seems like a formality, but there is the interesting story of, could Live Golf players come and play on the PGA Tour if a deal is reached soon, maybe this season? Is that a possibility?
I think it's a likelihood at this stage. That is a conversation the tour has had internally in terms of, if there is a deal reached in principle, what are the olive branches, what cross-pollination exists before you actually get to whatever the settled landscape looks like, because that settled landscape is most likely a couple of years away in terms of what we see consistently. So they are looking for wins that they can point to for fans, certainly through 2025. And I think that could potentially lead to Live players being invited onto PGA Tour events. The question is, how many Live players are actually interested in playing PGA Tour events? That's an assumption we all make that may be a misconception. I think a lot of Live guys aren't really that interested in playing. Some are, and I think some will be, but I don't necessarily think all of them are that interested in playing. And to me, the interesting part of this potential conversation today, Todd, is how it changes the parameters of the deal that have been proposed, because Donald Trump has consistently said he wants to see one tour. Well, that's exactly the opposite of what the DOJ was telling the PGA Tour over the course of the last year, because in their mind, one tour meant less opportunities for players to ply their trade. So the idea of a merger would have been considered an antitrust violation, a red flag. There is a scenario here where it might not simply be a matter of just PIF investment in the PGA Tour that we've all been talking about. There's a scenario in which LIV could move under the PGA Tour's umbrella.
Correct.
If they're willing to approve that, in which case, does the PGA Tour have the license to then kill LIV Golf as a field economic experiment? Because we all know that President Trump has one language, which is the language of ratings. So he's going to look at LIV and say that there's in no scenario in which that is a brand worth betting on. So if it moves under the PGA Tour's umbrella, there is a scenario in which the Trump administration might have no problem with the PGA Tour saying this is a failed experiment, this is our new landscape, we're going to move on in a different direction that doesn't potentially involve LIV at all.
That sounds like President Trump maybe even sound like a stakeholder in all this as well. It's interesting. Rex, I want to bring you back in, and I want to go back to what Eamon just mentioned. The likelihood, according to Eamon, that LIV golfers could be playing in PGA Tour events in 2025, this season, if this deal happens quickly. Two-part question here. What would that say to the public, and what would that say to the membership of the PGA Tour?
Well, I'll go one step further. I like that Eamon put it this year. I could say it's a possibility of next month with the Players' Championship looming. I spoke with one LIV player who's actually heard from the PGA Tour about the possibility of showing up at the flagship event. So let's put that in context. The message it sends to fans is that, yes, we understand. We hear you. We know that you want the game to be reunited. We know you want to see the best players from both tours playing against each other more often. I think that would be a very powerful statement. Now, what it would mean actually for the other tour members is what Eamon just touched on. Whatever is going to happen today, if there is some sort of agreement in principle either today or in the weeks going forward, it's the nuts and bolts. It's the machinations behind the scenes of how do you make those two sides stick? How do you put them, quote unquote, under one umbrella? That's going to be the difficult part. That's the part that Adam Scott touched on in those comments of his. The idea that there is going to be PGA Tour members that don't want to see this happen and that somehow you're going to have to push it through. It's not going to be an easy sell.
No, it's not, too. And let's not forget that the PGA Tour reduced fields in events this year, too. So, you know, there was a lot of upset players that they feel like they're not getting playing opportunities. And now you bring the LIV golfers into the mix, and that's going to even cause more controversy, right?
It certainly is. And it will very much depend upon what criteria the PGA Tour would set to apply to certain LIV golfers. Because, frankly, a lot of the guys who are playing on LIV no longer have status of any kind on the PGA Tour. There are obvious guys who do DeChambeau, Koepka, Rahm, Cam Smith, guys like that. So it will very much depend how narrow is that carve-out for an exemption for LIV players as an olive branch in there. And it was certainly a conversation in some circles on the tour, the idea that that might happen if there was a breakthrough far enough ahead of the Players' Championship. There is a complication to that in that LIV does have an event in Singapore the same week as the Players' Championship. It has an event the prior week in Hong Kong as well. It has an event at Donald Trump's course at Doral in Miami in April, the week before the Masters. So if they are to carve out an exemption for LIV players as an olive branch, as a win for fans, which is how it would be presented, then they would have to be very careful in terms of who's getting that invite and where it's actually happening.